So, hello, welcome everybody to this panel today. This is Fibre to the Home Market UK. Can we sustain the pace? And we have a really excellent panel here for you today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel, and then the panel are going to kind of give their statement on who they are, what their expectations are for the fibre to the home market in the UK. And then we'll hopefully get into a really great discussion. I'd love to hear from the audience, so if you've got questions, then please feel free to ask those questions to the audience, and I'll give some time for that during the discussion. Okay, so let me introduce, first of all, we've got Lindsey Fussell from Ofcom, we've got Polly Weitzman from CityFibre, we've got Oliver Bradley from Macquarie, and we've got Catherine Colloms from Openreach. So Lindsey, can I ask you to start?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you very much, Roshene. So as Roshene said, I'm Lindsey Fussell. I head up Ofcom's telecoms regulation. Ofcom is the communications regulator for the UK. So 3 quick points by way of introduction for me. First, where we've come from in relation to FTTH in the UK. So looking back to 2019, just months before we were all about to go into the pandemic lockdowns, the number of premises in the UK with FTTH, full fibre, stood at 10%. So we were quite a long way behind most of the rest of Europe at that point, and the position clearly wasn't sustainable looking forward. Our regulatory approach, which we set out in our last market review in 2021, was to seek to incentivise the rollout of gigabit-capable networks through competition. So encouraging, incentivising companies to build competing networks across the UK. And we said at that point that we thought that around 80% of premises could be reached by gigabit-capable through commercial build. And the government, in fact, committed up to £5 billion to cover the remaining 20%. So that's where we were. Second point, kind of my view on where we are now. The sort of great thing is that we have seen loads of investment and build over there since that time. Last year, at the end of last year, we reported the UK was now at 57% of full fibre, so that's a really fast uptake, and 78% if you look at gigabit capable, which includes Virgin Media's cable upgrade. So we expect that 80% expectation I mentioned, we expect to reach that around 2 years earlier than we thought. On the other, giving the kind of broader context, the investment build is fantastic, but there are challenges for companies who have been deploying that build. I should say up to about the competitors to Openreach, the UK's incumbent, have built to about a third of premises. So we have seen build by an awful lot of other companies as well as the incumbent. What are some of the challenges? Well, take-up stands at 30%. That's not too bad, but that's an average, and there are really big differences between operators and geographies. And some of that is harder for newer entrants. Indeed, those who are trying to wholesale their new networks are dependent, obviously, on getting business from the large retail ISPs, not all of whom are yet prepared to multi-source. Of course, like lots of Europe, we've seen higher inflation, higher interest rates, which has made cost of build and cost of finance harder. And we've also seen real fragmentation of the competition in the UK. So we've got about 150 altnets who are either building or planning to build full fibre. And clearly there are not economies of scale there for all of them. We've started to see some consolidation, but there's clearly more to come. So that's my sort of take on the market as we stand. Final very quick point, where do we go from here? Well, from us as the regulator, where we go from here is our next market review, which we've just kicked off and which looks to finish in March 2026. Just a couple of things about our approach. Firstly, when we set our strategy in 21, we said we expected this to be a 10-year framework because we recognised the long-term payback on investment, and we stand by that, and indeed the commitment to honour the fair bet as and when that becomes relevant. But we also said, and we also stand by this, that the right place for the UK is to have sustainable network competition, both in the investment cycle, but also beyond that on an ongoing basis, because we think that delivers the maximum benefits for UK consumers in terms of quality of service, choice, affordability, innovation, and so on. So for us, the question for this review is very much going to be how we best promote that sustainable network competition into the future, and that's very much what the work that we'll be kicking off. So I guess the title of the panel was, can we sustain the pace? And for us, I think that pace is not just about investment and build, it's about what the nature of the UK market looks like going forward in terms of sustainable competition. That's it.
Thank you. Can I go to you next then, Polly?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Polly Weitzman. I'm with CityFibre. As I'm sure many of you know, CityFibre is very strongly placed to be the third national network that Ofcom set out as an aspiration in its current market review. We're at about 3.5 million premises at the moment. We did 1 million last year and 1 million the year before that, and we want to keep up that pace. In the first few years, we were doing that through entirely organic growth, but this year we're doing it through a mixture of organic growth and acquisition, picking up the point that Lindsey made about the need for there to be some consolidation in the market because the market's very fractured. I should say, perhaps, that before I joined CityFibre, which I did in 2021, just after the market review came out, I worked at Ofcom. I was Ofcom's general counsel, and I was responsible in part for the digital infrastructure strategy that led to the market review, which put forward competition in networks, wholesale network competition. Why did I go to CityFibre? I went to CityFibre when I left Ofcom because I really actually believe really strongly in network competition. I think competition is the only way in the UK that we were ever going to drive investment, and through investment, much better outcomes for consumers. Lindsey's right. There's been quite a lot of success. Coverage figures are higher, I think, than anybody anticipated. Private investment has been greater than everybody anticipated, and as I said, CityFibre is at the heart of that. But take-up is pretty low, and the take-up figure that Lindsey referred to is predominantly take-up by Openreach and the BT Group. So if you read across, and I'm sure Catherine will comment on this, if you read across BT's published figures onto Ofcom's figures in its last Connected Nations report, 81% of all take-up is on the BT network. So that's not competition. There is, as Lindsey also referred to, quite a difficult problem in the UK, which is that there's a lot of concentration, structural concentration at the retail level. BT is vertically integrated and not looking as though it's ever going to want to go onto another network. Virgin is vertically integrated. So there are some real barriers to competition, which is beginning to emerge, becoming, as Lindsey said, material and sustainable. I think it's absolutely within reach of the UK to end up with a properly competitive market. I think there is a danger that if people are not bold enough, actually all that the UK will succeed in doing is re-entrenching the BT monopoly, albeit in full fibre. But I think the prize, which is a prize for everybody in the UK PLC consumers, and clearly the private investors, but it is a prize, is within reach. I think the next market review, Ofcom's next market review, is going to be critical. It's going to take place from 2026 to 2031. I think some of the issues that are barriers in the market we're only just beginning to grapple with. But I think it's entirely possible, and I think I would sit here and I would ask everybody who's sort of representing, whether it's the regulator or the incumbent monopolist or the investors, to really believe that competition in the UK is properly achievable in the next 5 to 7 years.
Thank you.
Bit of a plea there, everybody.
Oliver, can we come to you and hear what your perspective is?
Hello, everyone. I'm Oliver Bradley. I'm Senior Managing Director at Macquarie and responsible for our digital infrastructure investment business, the principal investment business of Macquarie. First, I should point out I'm very happy to be the token male on the panel, which is it's actually the second time this year I have been the token male on the panel, which I think actually is a positive trend for our industry. And sticking to the positives initially, there's a lot that we should. We have reason to be very positive about in the UK. There's been a huge amount of investment in the last few years. And we're talking about sort of continuing the speed. I think something like 5 million fibre homes were built in the last year alone in the UK, which is, really is a genuinely staggering achievement. And while more than half of homes, I think, are have access to full fibre, and that's still probably behind some of the other European markets, we're on track, I think, to be right up there with most of the rest of our European peers over the next few years. And I think that's a hugely positive thing, and has happened quite quickly in the last few years. I previously had a role in government, and in the 2015 to 2017 for the Treasury, one of our concerns there was there just simply wasn't investment coming into the sector, and it was hard to get fibre built. And BT wasn't building fibre at that point, saying that we didn't need it. And it was that investment in the altnets that really drove BT to build, because they realised that they were going to be overbuilt and lose out if they didn't do it themselves. So I think and this is where I sort of would depart a little bit in terms of the benefits of network competition. So I think at that point it was a very important motivator to sort of drive action and all these altnets getting funding drove build and drove a reaction from BT, and that's very, very positive. And I obviously am a big believer in competition, a big believer in that. I would take slight issue whether network competition is inherently a good for consumers, because one of the good things about fibre is it sort of works, and it's not very differentiated. A fibre network, in theory, should just work. And obviously you can think about whether it's XGS-PON or GPON and things like that, but most of them move on the same sort of upgrade paths. So on the whole, a fibre network works. And we don't really, if we want to think about in the days when there was electricity competition, we're not really that interested in the wires into our homes. We just want to make sure that when we turn the light on, it works. We obviously do care about the service we get from our utility. We care about the price we pay fundamentally. But actually, if you can bring down some of those input costs, then actually that can be a way of getting cheaper prices to the consumer. And if people can share infrastructure that doesn't need to be differentiated, isn't a key differentiator, then that could have a more positive outcome, for the consumers. Now, there's lots of nuances there, and it isn't necessarily. But I think the idea that infrastructure competition necessarily is good for consumers and necessarily leads to lower prices, I think is something that we should think about. Maybe we can talk about. I think the other sort of challenge, the big challenges the UK face from an investor perspective, and by default then from a consumer perspective, is we have had that rush of investment, and we did have it over the last few years. And in some ways, probably a little bit too much of it. And what I mean by that is too many companies got funded that maybe shouldn't, and in a normal world wouldn't have got funded. And I think there was a perfect storm in 2020, 2021, very, very low cost interest rates, so lots of capital that was essentially free, and also then COVID making infrastructure investors in particular realize that actually our airports that we thought were safe infrastructure investors are not so safe anymore, but digital infrastructure, which we thought maybe was a tech, actually is an infrastructure. It's an essential service. So I think there was this realization happened. So a lot of infrastructure investment rush in. Now, as we've sort of moved out of that in the last year, a couple of things have happened, I think. So first of all, interest rates have gone up, so money's less cheap and no longer free, and that means that hurdle rates are higher. I think some of the business plans that got funded have struggled, and they've struggled, for one of two reasons. I think one can be in certain areas it's harder than people thought. It's harder to build. It takes a bit longer, and people have to be a bit more patient. I think in more urban areas we've had a customer problem across all of our businesses in BT and CityFibre and all the altnets. I think convincing people that full fibre is something they should want has been a challenge. And part of the issue is some of the ISPs spent the last few years telling people they had fibre when they didn't. And so now the sort of the marketing is now, come and have our fibre, it's real fibre this time, honest. The last stuff before wasn't. And these are really difficult messages. And then the other thing that we sort of talk about a lot is a bit of an obsession with speed. And people rightly think, well, I don't need 500 megs. And it's like, well, we're selling fibre on the wrong sort of things. We should be selling it on reliability, on symmetry, on green credentials. There's all sorts of other benefits of fibre. The speed is just one of many. So we've got one of the challenges is there then on take up. So all those things sort of coming together, it being a bit harder, taking a bit longer, take up being a bit slower has meant providers of capital, both debt and equity, it hasn't quite worked out as they thought it would work out, and that's had an impact on sentiment. So when good businesses now are looking to raise capital, it is harder, because there's a general plague in all your houses sort of sentiment among some providers of capital. Not all, by any means, and there's plenty of lenders and plenty of investors who are able to sort of do the work and see the good for the bad. But there's definitely, and this is not even just in the UK, we see it across Europe, there's a bit of, I don't want to take another fibre deal to my investment committee. And you get a bit of that without people even wanting to engage in the nuances of your business. And that's actually across Europe as well. And it's slightly more acute in some countries and less acute in others. But, and actually I would argue Germany actually probably faces more challenges in that sense than the UK, just because it's all more expensive. So those are some of the things we're dealing with. So an awful lot to be positive about, and a lot of challenges that we do need to think about and address. So it's certainly not time for complacency.
Thank you, Oliver. So, Catherine, let me come to you so you can give your thoughts on this topic.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Colloms, and I work for Openreach, who definitely are the incumbent. I would challenge whether we're a monopoly when there are over 600 ISPs operating in the UK, most of them on our network, and we have over 150 altnets building. But Openreach, for those who don't know it well, we are essentially the UK's national broadband company. We built out the superfast network to nearly 90% over the sort of previous decades, and we're now pivoting the company to be a fibre company. And look, I'd agree with some of the comments that have been made that we were late to the party, quite frankly. The reason we were late is we'd invested billions in the superfast network, i.e. VDSL. And actually VDSL has served the UK incredibly well. While we were very low on the FTTH stats over the last few years, we actually have performed incredibly well in terms of GDP per head as a digital economy, penetration of devices, and all of that was supported by the original VDSL network. Anyway, we know that is in the past, so we are now very rapidly pivoting to fully fibering the UK alongside other people who are sitting on stage with me. We have a task and an ambition to get to 25 million premises by the end of 2026. We are doing incredibly well on that journey, so we have passed over 13.5 million homes. We have 4.6 million customers on the network, so our take-up, back to this take-up conversation, is around 34% at the moment. And as Oliver says, I think the pace of build that we've managed to achieve within the UK is frankly faster than any other country, I think, probably ever anywhere, unless you're in a very communist state where you can bulldoze through homes. So we're alone building at 1 million premises a quarter. And we're connecting at a rate of 35,000 customers a quarter. So I think we are really flying, and we've seen that in some of the new tables that were released yesterday by the Council. You know, we're up there, whereas we were definitely languishing a few years ago. In terms of, can we sustain the pace? Frankly, no, not forever. We're at peak build and sort of peak competition, I would say, at the moment in the UK. Our peak build rate is going to be 4 million. We're going to sustain that for a couple of years to get to that big 25 million number, but then we are going to decline. Not least because at that stage, we would have fibred the vast majority of the UK. So I think the FTTH Council released their own predictions yesterday of when we might get to 30 million premises in the UK in 2029. And I think that's sort of roughly there and abouts right. We'll have done the majority of the UK by the end of the decade. So the pace is inevitably going to decline. We've got that peak rate at the moment, give it a couple of years, and then the industry industry will naturally contract and it'll shift into trying to build the very hard to reach premises. And for those of you who haven't visited England, believe me, there are some incredibly difficult and challenging places to reach. You know, Scotland, Wales, we have valleys, mountains, we have tons of islands. Probably if you're Scandinavian, you sort of have the same challenges in trying to get to sort of really remote communities. But I think in terms of the challenges going forward, that is definitely one. How are you getting to those very, very hard to reach places? And what is the technology mix? Because I think it probably isn't a 100% full fibre solution to those. I think it's also really important, though, that we remember that we're only 57% fully fibred. You know, we talk a little bit about this is all in the bag and we can just bank the fact that we're going to get to that 30 million or sort of 80, 90%. It is not a done deal. The business cases, as Oliver is talking about, are frankly challenging. They were always challenging. Our business case as Openreach, and BT is the parent company, had a 20-year payback. So this is not a get-rich-quick scheme. You've got to be in it for the long haul. And those business cases change very much depending on the economic conditions. And we've all seen this very inflationary environment, which has been extremely challenging. So it is not a done deal that we're going to get to 80, 90% unless we have the right regulatory and policy environment. So as Lindsey was talking about, that the next review that's being done by Ofcom is really critical to maintain, I think, the spirit of the original review, which has created this incredibly competitive marketplace, which is driving all this growth. So I think that is really important. We still, frankly, need just the basic barrier-busting set of measures. Building fibre is complex and just tricky. You know, it's fundamentally a civil engineering project. It's not a digital project. And anything you can do to make that build easier and quicker and cheaper is really critical. So there are some basic barriers that we still have in terms of build and also access, which we could maybe touch on. And then I think just my last point is related to Oliver's. You know, if the challenge is around take-up, and there is no point in all of us having built these networks unless people are on the networks, we have to do more to talk to customers about the benefits of the network. I completely agree that the market has been incredibly confusing for consumers in terms of terminology. The fact that we focus on speed, which was always Virgin's USP and actually worked very well for them for the years. Most people have enough speed at the moment, even if they're on the old VDSL platform. It got us through COVID. It kind of works. So we have to be making more of some of the other benefits, like, as you say, reliability. And actually, I think there's more we could do there in terms of shifting public services onto a sort of digital hub so that people can access them in that way. But to do that, we also have to look at issues around accessibility, literacy. You know, it's not actually a price issue why people are not taking up broadband at all, let alone full fibre. It's actually about a digital literacy problem as well.
Thank you. So everybody here on the panel has touched on a couple of points on take-up, on competition, on rural. So let me start with the take-up. There's been an awful lot of discussion in the conference here about take-up, about concerns on take-up. The EU have recently published a white paper on discussing copper switch-off. So I'd like to ask all the panel, first of all, how can we encourage take-up in the UK market, and what your thoughts are on strategic planning of a copper switch-off in the UK, and how that might play a part in both encouraging take-up, but also maintaining the pace of deployment. You know, if there is a kind of date when it's got to be done by, whether that is something that we should consider in the UK. And so, Lindsey, let me start with you, because as the regulator, perhaps that's going to fall somewhere into your remit.
Sure. So I won't say too much about how you promote take-up. If I was any good at selling things, then I wouldn't be employed by the regulator, would I? So I'll leave that to those who are better placed. I think, you know, turning to copper switch-off, though, I think that is obviously something we'll need to think about as part of the next market review. It felt too early. We have had some very limited steps towards it. Catherine can no doubt say more, but we have a system whereby Openreach can stop selling copper, called a stop sell, once they have reached a certain point of coverage in an exchange. So they're not migrating people who are on it, but they can stop providing it to new customers. And that is taking place in some exchanges across the UK. But we obviously have to think about moving forward what the right approach is. Look, I think it's something you have to approach with a bit of care. I think in principle, of course, it's right that both from a consumer perspective, it makes absolutely no sense to leave people on ageing, less reliable infrastructure, which is less environmentally sustainable, and all of those things. And of course, it's also part of the business case, the ability to stop serving legacy infrastructure. So clearly there are all sorts of good reasons for it. I think from a regulatory perspective, there are two things we have to think about. One is obviously consumers, and I would want us to get FTTH take up quite a lot further down the track before we were thinking of kind of mandatory migrations. I don't think we're there yet. And secondly, there is an impact on competition. If you believe that there is a moment when the moment that a customer first switches to full fibre is a key moment in the journey, then you clearly have to think quite carefully about that in those considerations.
A couple of things I would comment from my perspective. I mean, I should have mentioned my introduction, but our main investment in the UK is in an altnet Veneas, a rural focus, so altnet. And in some ways, it's easier to sell in rural markets because, and why we like it, is because we are not only the only fibre network, but we're generally a lot better than the copper that's available there. But it's still a sell, right? It's still not. It's not like people are sort of holding ticker tape parades to welcome us. You have to, some are, but some you have to. You do still have to sell. You still have to really sell the business and sell the benefits and sell the benefits of fibre versus copper. I think with copper switch off, we've got to be really careful that it doesn't undermine the sort of messages that you were saying about network competition, because when you talk about copper switch off and stop sales and things like that, you're talking about how you're driving demand onto Openreach's network, but not necessarily other people's network. Yep. And so, like for us in the rural areas where Openreach maybe won't go for a long time, it would help us to have copper switched off, right? But so we need to sort of think about a fair way that it's done. So it isn't just about Openreach able to turn off copper when they're built out their fibre network to drive more people onto their fibre network at the expense of other people's fibre networks. We do need to think very carefully about that. Part of that then obviously has to be with the altnets about what sort of wholesale solution they have, because clearly the quid pro quo there is if that's the fibre network there, then everyone needs to have access to it. So those are some of the issues we've got to think about. But we do need to be really careful that we aren't having, because I think copper switch off probably is the key thing that will ultimately drive it. We're seeing it. We have another investment in Spain where copper switch off is very advanced and probably will have taken place almost completely over the next year. There, Telefonica, as part of that, is prepared to wholesale on other people's networks. Yeah. So we have a wholesale business there. Telefonica is a customer of ours in a small part of it where they don't have any network, but they want to turn off the copper, and so their customers will wholesale. So I think I understand the arguments that BT have made in the past around having your captive customer helps drive investment, et cetera, but I think as we move to a more fibred country, we do need to think about what's in the best interest and how we can promote competition better at the ISP level and support all these networks coming.
I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think, as Lindsey alluded to, this isn't just a UK issue. I mean, it's in the white paper quite clearly that the Commission is very worried that copper switch off is effectively used to re-entrench the monopoly. I think in the first 5-year market review, Ofcom took a fairly narrow approach to this issue, perfectly understandably, I think, but saw it as a Openreach issue for Openreach to sort of deal with. I think Oliver's absolutely right. Where we are now is quite clear. It's not an Openreach issue for Openreach to deal with, because forced migration just forecloses the market from competition, and copper switch off gives you a perfect forced migration position. I think Ofcom, I'm sure we're going to have lots of conversations about this. Ofcom, as I think Lindsey's indicated, needs to think about this particular issue rather differently for the next market review. and ask itself how it ensures that actually it's a proactive opening up of the market rather than a closing of the market, whilst also moving people across sensibly and quickly from copper to fibre.
Catherine?
Yeah, look, it's a really important principle, and there is absolutely no point in running two networks. I mean, you know, sort of sitting here as Openreach, it's BT who run the networks, but there is no point in having two networks. And from an environmental perspective as well, the old VDSL and copper networks use a vast amount of electricity. BT actually uses 1% of the entire UK's energy to run networks. So the trend and the move towards shutting down copper is obviously the right trend. And I think, you know, as Lindsey says, it was too early in the last review. You know, it's right to look at it in this review. I mean, I would say, counter obviously to the points that Oliver and Polly are making, the copper switch-off process at the moment is incredibly slow. You know, actually shutting down exchanges and getting and migrating 100% of people who have existing service onto a new service is quite tricky because, as we know, trying to get fibre to 100% of community is very challenging. So actually, we haven't done a lot of it at all. We've trialled it in a couple of places, and so we're learning how we do it, and in particular, how do you engage the CPs so that they're contacting their customers. But it is not easy, is our sort of conclusion from having tried to do this. My point, though, is if you've rolled out, you know, tens of millions of full fibre connections already, customers have that choice now. So customers have the choice in the UK in areas where we haven't got to, in terms of fibre, today to change and switch networks. So we basically feel that this needs to be a customer-led process. What you can't do is leave a customer without a connection. Also, what you can't do is move a customer to a different provider if you can't guarantee things like service levels. And frankly, you know, if you have a customer today, they may be an Openreach customer, but they're also potentially a Sky or a Zen or a TalkTalk customer. You know, those are their customers. TalkTalk has sold them that product. So therefore, when we're migrating a TalkTalk customer from copper to fibre. So I appreciate what you're trying to say here, but the idea that suddenly you have to switch something off in an area and, you know, put it up for grabs when you have existing customers through our own customers and the ISPs, you know, fundamentally it needs to be customer and commercially driven.
So, Catherine, you've come to service level. And Oliver, I was interested in what you said about investor sentiment. And I think it was Polly, you said how many altnets exist within the UK market. In terms of the customer, what role do you think that customer experience plays in encouraging take-up? And would you like to see a minimum service level agreement to customers, or is it your belief that competition will take care of that? And let me start with you, Catherine, there.
Yeah, so I think service is absolutely fundamental to this whole process and, you know, building confidence with customers and consumers. I mean, we obviously as Openreach have sort of very strict service levels in terms of what we as a wholesaler are supplying to our retail customers. That's obviously imposed on us, given we have significant market power. I think you have to be a little bit careful about what you're promising when it comes to the end customer, so in someone's premise, as opposed to necessarily the service we're providing to a retailer. I don't think you could ever promise, you know, 100% reliable connectivity just because a lot of the UK is going to be served by overhead and poles, and we see either, you know, road traffic accidents or in storms, stuff goes down. We're reliant on electricity companies to go back. I think there definitely could be something in conversations with customers back to the point about how do you sell full fibre, and reliability is and should be the number one reason why people are taking up a full fibre connection. And so I think definitely there needs to be a better conversation about that, whether that translates definitely into service for the customer. I do think, however, there needs to be more in terms of looking at the quality of builds, which ultimately then will impact on what that end services for a customer. Building full fibre is quite tricky. I mean, as those of you in Rome know, this is not a sort of just plug and play option. It is genuinely difficult and requires expertise, and that's partly why as Openreach, a lot of our suppliers have gone to the European market to try and get labour, because there are more experienced people out there. But I think, aside from the service levels, you need to ensure that the build that is being done by all the altnets out there is to a high enough standard and quality, which means it won't impact service, and also ensuring that that service on the network is as good as could be expected, because what we don't have at the moment is a kind of framework on what the expectations should be of time to repair, etc., for the altnet community, as opposed to just with Openreach.
Okay, any other?
Can I come in there? Yeah. So I agree. Performance for customers is really important. If you're the challenger, you have to have a lower price, better quality, better performance level product, because that's the only way in which you can try and challenge the... I'm going to use the word monopolist because I just can't see how you aren't a monopolist, but don't take it the wrong way. CityFibre has very high performance scores. You have to have very high performance scores. I think Openreach has really increased its performance scores recently, dramatically so. Well done to it. I think it's probably done that in light of the threat of competition from people like CityFibre. I mean, certainly when I was at Ofcom, I think we always felt service quality regulation was a pretty blunt instrument, and it's not the right way to create good performance for customers. You have to do that through the market conditions of competition. I think the other issue really is the issue that you were alluding to, which is consumer awareness and lack of switching. There's been so much misinformation in this market for so long by the incumbents. I mean, Ofcom's recently tried to help with that. I think that there's just a sort of whole process of trying to get movement in the market so that people are aware that there are choices on reliability, on service performance, on innovation, on pricing, and that they're able to take advantage of those. I would take issue with what you said earlier. I mean, I don't think fibre is just fibre. I think the networks that are being built are quite different from one another. I think some of them are built to a much higher standard than others. I would say CityFibre's is a very high standard. It's got a different network architecture from Openreach's. It's got really high reliability and availability. That's one thing. I'd also say innovation in service performance is a differentiator. CityFibre does something called proactive repair, which for consumers or customers is really, really important, which is that we gather the data from our network, which tells us where there's a fault. Before a customer even knows there's a fault, we take on the cost and the risk of going out to the customer premises and sorting it out on the belief that the vast majority of faults happen outside the home rather than in the home. These are all new things. What they're doing is they're raising the game with people like Openreach and others, and we will constantly innovate and change things. And I think that's actually what drives the differentiation that is so important for consumers. I think that's the prize.
And Lindsey, can I come to you and just ask you about whether you think the regulator has a role on setting minimum service levels in a market that does have so many possible providers?
So I guess a few points. I think, as Polly alluded to, at the network level, the only place we've set quality of service levels, of course, has been on Openreach, because that's where we regulate. We've done it on FTTC. We didn't do it on FTTH in the last market review. Again, it felt too early. Clearly, that's something we'll want to think about. But I would agree that I think they're quite a blunt tool. I think when we set them before, frankly, I don't think Catherine would disagree with this, that was at a point when Openreach's FTTC service levels were just not where they needed to be. And the level of competition, certainly at the network level, wasn't really there at that stage. And it felt, therefore, like the right place for the regulator to step in. But actually, I think we were always quite explicit that really our preference was to stop doing that, to get to a point where competition could drive that. And to the extent you had those, they were very much a backstop. Now, I'm not suggesting we're there now, and we will need to think about that. But I do believe that they're not the right tool to rely on. Just a couple of other points. I mean, firstly, I really agree with Polly that actually this idea of competition driving differentiation is really important. I hope with apologies for a really trite example, when I turn on my tap in the morning, I don't want the water to be purple. I'm not looking for innovation in my water provision. But when I'm thinking about the future of connectivity, I am looking for innovation. I am interested in innovation, of course, at all kinds of levels, at device level all the way down. I don't know what the future innovation in service or technology in full fibre is, but I'm going to bet there will be some. And so I do think competition and that differentiation, which is not just on price, is really important, which is why we kind of back that competitive strategy. We realise it's not going to be possible for all of the UK, but we think it's the right point. And then my very final point on service quality, I think one thing I am sort of playing around with in my mind, just at the consumer end user point, is that because of the reliability of full fibre, I think we are increasingly likely to get to a point where quite a lot of the faults are in the home rather than in the network. Notwithstanding storms and trees falling on cabinets and all the rest of it, that there will be faults on the network. And I think that will be quite confusing for consumers, because quite often it will be about their home Wi-Fi, their wiring, the way they've got the stuff set up. I think a lot of us have got kind of spaghetti-like wiring around our home from switching and different technologies. I do think that's probably quite an issue moving forward, actually, just for the end consumer. I don't know what the answer is. I suspect the answer is not regulation, but I do think that will probably become highlighted a lot more as people move on to full fibre.
Just picking up on my competition point, I suppose, which is, and I appreciate it's a more nuanced argument, but a lot of what you were just talking about there, Lindsey, is stuff that you can differentiate on the same glass tube that goes into the thing. There's not a lot of differentiation in the expensive bit of the network is the ducts and putting the glass tube in there. There isn't a lot of innovation that's happening in there. Where it is cheap to deploy networks, then it makes sense to have multiple networks. It makes sense to have multiple networks. But as you say, where we're building as Vineas in rural areas, it is costing us often significantly more than £1,000 a home pass to build a network. It's not good for consumers. Consumers don't want their nice villages dug up twice. It's not good for consumers to have another expensive network there. So there becomes a point. Networks are expensive. So there comes a point is, yes, you can have some differentiation on some of the active equipment. A lot of the differentiation it can be driven in the home through, and the ISPs can lead that with their CPE. I think you've got to consider the sort of the relative prices. If it's cheap to build a network, then that's great. Let's have a few networks and let's have them compete with each other. When it starts to get more expensive, the effect of multiple networks is just going to be to drive up cost, which then ultimately needs to be passed on to the consumer. And for a level of, are you capturing enough differentiation between those networks to justify that increase in cost? Now, the two extremes, very, very urban, where it costs maybe a couple of £100 to build a network, sure, have competition there, are rural areas where it costs more than £1,000. Competition at the network level doesn't make sense. We might need to think about it at the service provider level. But there's the sort of the grey area in between. So I think it's a nuanced argument, and I'm not saying there should be no competition, and we should go back to it being a regulated monopoly. But I just think you do need to think about where it makes most sense to compete in the network. And glass tubes in the ground, as long as they're built properly, and actually we do see in some networks we've acquired that they are always built properly, and I think that's true. But as long as they're built properly, they are going to sort of work.
And Lindsey, just to pick up on what Oliver's just said, in the next review, do you think Ofcom will be looking at the various layers within the network? So, for instance, the question of the physical network and whether it's ever possible to have competition in the physical fibre network, which I think is what Oliver's saying, versus what goes over it. So how we operate with, say, open access type providers.
I think, obviously, what we've looked to incentivise is the building of competing physical networks. Rather than the sharing of that network, I think what I absolutely would accept from what Oliver said is that, and I said it a little bit earlier, is, we know that it is not possible to have competition between networks everywhere in the UK. We acknowledge that up front. We hope the competitive dynamic has an impact even in those areas where there isn't competition. But clearly, that in rural areas, it is unlikely that we can have multiple networks. I would say that the rural build that we expected in the UK has been much greater than we thought in 2021.
Because it's got a better infrastructure characteristic. I mean, that's what infrastructure investors like us read is.
So that's been fantastic. In our last market review, we divided the UK into kind of area 1, 2 and 3, 1 which was going to be fully competitive where you could deregulate, 2 was where it was possible to have material and sustainable competition, and 3 where there was less likely to be. I think what we will be thinking about in this review is quite where Area 3 is now. It might well not be quite where we thought it was. And then in terms of where it is, what the right kind of regulation is there based on what we think the competitive dynamic looks like.
So I want to open up some questions to the audience, but before we go to the audience, I want to think about the positives. So Polly, I'd like to start with you, and from your perspective, what's working? What should we carry on doing? What's good about the environment in the UK and how it's contributing to competition and to the build?
Well, look, there's been a huge amount of private investment, and that's obviously a good thing. But as Oliver said, the environment for getting further private investment is more difficult at the moment. I think there's a need for further private investment. I think if there isn't, you do end up with a improved, updated national infrastructure under Openreach, but that isn't competition. So you want to continue to get the investment needed to roll out at least a third national network. There will be further consolidation, but I think you want this process to continue. I think, as I said, it's produced first of all, the threat of competition, been very successful, as Oliver said, Catherine said, everything that Openreach is doing, that's a good thing. Threat of competition and then emerging competition, but I think it's pretty fragile. So I think Ofcom's got quite a lot to do, if I can put it that way, in the next market review, which is 2026 to 2031, to promote that competition, to get it established by 31. And then I can see a slightly different landscape. Mm-hmm. I actually think the next 2 years are really important as well. So, Catherine's talked about what Openreach wants to do in the next 2 years. So the next 2 years are going to be really critical in ensuring that the fragile competition that started to appear doesn't disappear. And I think there are things that Ofcom can do in that period as well to help. Quite a lot of them are actually sort of more retail-focused than wholesale-focused because for all the reasons that we've discussed, we've got a basically stagnant retail market. It's pretty concentrated, vertically integrated. Switching levels are at about 12, 13% and have been for the last 5 or so years. Ofcom started to do some work on that, but I think actually it needs to do more. So I think, there's a lot of work that could be done in the next 2 years to try and get people to move. And while that's happening, if Ofcom can send the right signals about how it's there to promote long-term sustainable competition, exactly the conversation we've just had about the copper switch-off proposals this time around rather than last time around, then I think there will be more investment, and I think there will be further infrastructure competition that will emerge from that. And I remain completely committed to the idea that that's the right future.
And Oliver, from your perspective, you were talking about investors and how that has, that's been a thriving market, if you like, in the UK, albeit struggling right now. I mean, what are we doing right? What should we be doing more of to attract that private investment?
I think it's. I think business plans need to be executed well. I think that's probably something that we probably didn't as an investor community, didn't sort of appreciate fully enough that these things are quite hard, harder than people thought and people realise. And so you need to be a bit more patient and have the right team in place in the company. The quality of the management is very, very important. Quality of the team all the way down is very, very important, because although it sort of on the face of it seems quite simple, it's actually quite hard. It's particularly hard to do at scale as well. So you can build a small little network, quite easily, but to do it at scale is also very, very difficult. So I think that focus on execution, I think when there's a bit more, I think people investors in the UK, there just simply are too many altnets, and I think I think we'll see scale is important. So I think if we see consolidation, fewer bigger businesses are inherently less risky and easier things, particularly for infrastructure investors. And it does need to be, to your point, Catherine, about the length of paybacks, it does need to be that sort of infrastructure money that can take that long-term view, and they are inherently risk averse. And so as you can scale up these businesses, you are sort of de-risking and move to earnings, right? Move to profitability. You're part of the other challenge with these businesses from an investor perspective is as well as the capex, you're also funding an awful lot of opex, and that's quite hard to do for a very long period of time, and it's necessary, but it's hard to do for a very long period of time. So that's sort of a real focus on profitability, and not just build, and then then they sort of really think about how you're driving in revenue, driving in managing costs, and driving in profit, and having profitability, so that the capital can be used to fund the networks and not the opex. Catherine,
what's going well? What do you want more of?
Look, I mean, as everyone has said, I think actually it is going very well. I mean, I've been at these sessions for a number of years, and I remember when I first came in, really it wasn't going very well, and I think it is a testament to Ofcom and also the government in their sort of policy framing as well that they put out in conjunction with the original review, that they've genuinely created an environment which is attracting loads of investment and is incentivising everyone, because we had to be incentivised as the incumbent to commit to an incredibly large and long-term business case. This is 15 billion of pounds of private money that's going into this build. So actually, I think more of the same, quite frankly. Let's continue this. Let's ensure there is competition. Competition makes us all better. It definitely makes Openreach better. I don't deny that one of the reasons why we are building this volume of FTTP is because we had a more competitive environment. That's also driven up our service levels, which were at record highs. So competition, as you say, is good for the market and good for consumers, and just drives up standards everywhere. I would sort of say, coming back to the can you keep up the pace and what more do you need to do, we're going to start to hit the really difficult bits, and you sort of talked a bit about rural. We have done better in rural, I think, than we expected. We at Openreach are, I think, the only builder who are committed to a balanced build. So we aim to build a third of the whole 25 million, which is about 6.2 million premises in Ofcom's Area 3, which basically is the sort of harder to reach bits of the UK. And I think a lot of the smaller altnets have really great niches in building in rural, as Oliver says, because it has sort of a better shape and characteristic to do. So, but it's going to get harder. It's genuinely going to get much harder to do that. We have Project Gigabit, which is the government's sort of funding to get to some of the really hard to reach premises, but there's still a gap between those really hard to reach subsidised premises and where some of our builds might get to in certain areas. So I think in terms of areas to focus on, alongside take up in the education process for customers, which I think is definitely a real challenge we've discussed, I think it's about how are you not leaving people behind. And I think if you're thinking about a potential incoming Labour government, which will, I think, looking at the polls, happen probably towards the end of this year, they are super focused on that. They are super focused on the left behinds. And it's not just rural. You have pockets of cities where there's pockets of digital divide. That's partly because it's very, very expensive to build in, for example, Manchester city centre. So no one's done it, pretty much. And we've tended to go to suburban areas. And that's also where things like access sort of come into play. So there are differences of opinion about this issue on the panel regarding multi-dwelling units and blocks of flats. But as Openreach, we have built to over 1 million blocks of flats which we cannot access and cannot get into because we can't get the permissions and wayleaves from a landlord. And that fundamentally is creating a new digital divide. So we have to be able to try and address these issues with all these different characteristics of highly rural, highly urban. And I think that's the challenge for the next period.
One small thing to add, we were talking about it before, but actually part of that approach, and it's a bit sacrilegious to talk about at the Fibre to the Home conference, but is that multi-technologies and thinking about actually in some places gigabit fixed wireless technologies and things like that. You know, the project, they call Project Gigabit, I suppose, because actually that again, without wanting to focus on the speed, but you need to sort of but the point is it's about everyone having really good, reliable services, and technology is evolving to in that side.
So I'm really interested in making sure that we get an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. I think we've got somebody with a microphone. So if you could raise your hands, let everybody know who you are, what your question is, and we'll see if we can get some discussion going.
Thanks. Hi, Dean Bubley from Disruptive Analysis. Actually, that last point hits home. I live in a muse off a muse, and so I'm on super fast. What I haven't heard is anything about non-residential reach for fibre, and whether it's business premises, whether it's mobile backhaul, and increasingly front haul, given the UK government likes Open RAN. Or street furniture, anything else. When we do the review, and when we look at the future of the rest of the deployment, are we going to be giving as much emphasis to the non-residential endpoints?
Did you want to come in first?
No, you go. You go.
I was not going to say very much more than, it's probably inevitable that we do talk, you're right, more about the kind of residential premises, but the review will absolutely be covering business connectivity markets as well, and looking at all of those questions in relation to Ethernet and a whole set of other issues. So, yeah, we will absolutely be looking at those.
No, I think you're right in terms of the need to focus on obviously great digital connectivity for businesses alongside residential. Some of our network architecture doesn't lend itself very well to maybe tackling some of that. And our 25 million number includes homes and businesses, and we've collected a large number of businesses. We've collected over 11,500 pubs, so people can watch and continue to watch their sports on a Sunday afternoon. But there are pockets of businesses which are more challenging. I think in particular business parks, or you sort of have little hubs potentially in more rural areas where possibly on agricultural farms you sort of have little businesses clubbing together. Those frankly sometimes are just not economical in terms of the distance and how hard it is to get into some of them. We've been working quite hard to try and address it because we were definitely under-indexed when it came to business and things like business parks. We've tried to see if we can bridge that with doing more innovative technologies in rural areas. We have something called SHEs, which are subtended head ends, which basically use our fibre VDSL cabinets as mini exchanges, and that gets the fibre deeper into the exchange. We've been able to use that actually to get to some of these sort of little pockets of businesses. But I think you're right, it's really important we don't just think about sort of homes, but we put businesses front and centre when we're thinking about great connectivity.
I think we've got another question from the audience.
Thank you. Actually, an observation, a question, and an open-ended statement. That chair would have been really great if it had been filled by a representative from Virgin Media to give a more balanced approach across the discussion topics here.
Yeah, I should say, actually, we did have Conal Henry slated to be on the panel from Fibre. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Conal couldn't be here.
Well, leads on to my next question. Polly, Lindsey, you're both current Ofcom and ex-Ofcom, and within the first 5 minutes, I noticed the four panelists talk about consumer choice, yet 2 of the 3 proposed national networks have not yet joined the one-touch switching company hub to allow customers to make that choice seamlessly. I'd love to know why, and maybe in the next review, that you can mandate that. And I noticed Polly smiling, but the two
I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. So I'm kind of thinking, why don't you take a bit more of a firmer action in terms of driving that customer choice? Because we're all techie, well, most of us are techies here, we know how to do it, but it's still a very friction-orientated position. And thirdly, looking back, post the original telecoms duopoly review, and I am going back to the mid-80s now, and I take the example of the cable franchises, it was franchised, so there was no overbuild. What we have done as an industry is almost set up the capital markets for some sort of failure. There's 25 million homes in the UK, 20% are deemed by the government as non-commercially viable for all sorts of reasons, 1% are not serviceable. If I go back to Connected Britain, I think it was 2021, the keynote suggested 3 times overlay, and a number of 85 to 90 million homes passed was business cased. That's not a very efficient capital model for efficiency. Why, if you had a rear view mirror, would you have not adopted a different model, such as the NBN model in Australia, or the model that is running out very efficiently in France, or what we learned from the cable? And I know it had its challenges, but it was a much more capital efficient model there and everything. Sorry, long question, long.
It's yours, I think.
Yeah, I'll kick off and anybody else can join in. So starting, I think there's 2 main points. One-touch switch. So I don't need to mandate one-touch switch in the next access review because we've already mandated it. It was mandated to be introduced in April 2023, and it is of real disappointment to Ofcom that it has not happened, is what I would say. As you know, a revised implementation industry is now announced on the 12th of September. I think I've got that right, 2024. At the moment, all of our focus is on making that happen and putting pressure on industry to make that happen, because only industry can make this happen, to be clear. This clearly is a hub into which all companies can join. This is not something that we can physically make happen as the regulator. There is a bit of a question, and we've opened an enforcement programme around this about, what action we might want to take in relation to delays, and that remains on the table. But at the moment, our focus is on getting this in, because I agree with you, it's the right thing for consumers. On your broader question about the right model for fibre rollout, look, there are, as you rightly say, there are lots of different models that different countries have adopted. The UK government looked at this before the 2021 market review. They published something called the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, and we obviously looked at it as well in that context. And in particular, I should say, they looked at, if you like, the regional sort of franchised model, which, sort of a variant, I guess, of what's happened in France, and concluded that that wasn't the right model for the UK. The model they wanted to create was the one of competitive networks. And, if I had my time again, no, I wouldn't take a different decision. I think, based on what we've been talking about today, I think, competitive networks has delivered a huge amount for the UK. There are clearly challenges ahead. We don't expect competition to impose a constraint on Openreach everywhere, or even to be necessarily present everywhere. But I still think that it has achieved a lot and has a lot still to achieve. I don't know if anybody else.
I can see a few more questions. I'd like to make sure that other people get a voice. Can we go to?
Hi, I'm Alex Burkhead, Telco Titans. It's sort of on the same question around overbuild. Openreach has been kind of terrifying the altnets by saying it's going to build everywhere, overbuild everything. And that includes in markets like the Isle of Wight that are pretty much the altnet is built out. But Oliver started off initially questioning overbuild as well, but he then revised that around rural versus urban, which I think is very valid. But he also, his company also used to own Thames Water. So monopoly providers, they have issues. I know it sounds nice to have one national network, but it tends to get a little bit expensive, lack of innovation. Catherine's admitted that Openreach has been galvanized by competition. But does Openreach need to stop threatening altnets with overbuild? And it's not sometimes, and Deutsche Telekom's got even more trouble with this in Germany, basically frightening the market, rightly or wrongly. I think there's, but there's a lot of rows about that.
Should I start?
Yes.
I hope we're not, like, threatening. That's definitely not the
So
intention.
you're promising.
No, definitely not the intention. I mean, I think we've actually tried to be incredibly transparent about what we're trying to do at Openreach. So look, we do have a very large build number. 25 million is not the whole of the UK. I think it's about 33 million premises at the moment, but it's a lot of the UK. And we've also said that we'll continue building after that. So, you know, our intention is effectively to remain the national broadband provider across the UK, and that's also what our customers are expecting of us. So what we have said in terms of overbuild is, while we're not specifically targeting any particular area, because we're going to build so much, we are effectively going to be everywhere. You know, so at some stage, we're probably going to get there. We've also, again, we have an obligation which isn't on the other operators in the UK, to publish where we're going to go. So we worked with government on a sort of transparency model whereby we say where we're going to go in advance, which hopefully, well, from all perspective, they can at least see the sort of immediate intention, some of the phasing. I mean, interestingly, I actually wonder whether more operators publishing where they intend to go could help this whole problem of overbuild. You know, I mean, we see it at the moment because we obviously have I think we have 168 operators using PIA at the moment. You know, we often see potentially even fourth operators showing up to try and put equipment on our poles in certain areas. And if you're the fourth operator coming, I mean, I just don't see how you're ever going to be able to get a return. But they're still going to put the infrastructure on our poles. So is that, you know, because people are just blinkered and just going ahead with the model no matter what? Is it because maybe there isn't clarity on what is there and what is being rolled out? So actually, if there was potentially more transparency and not just Openreach, then it might be easier for everyone to see where there is existing networks and where, therefore, they might want to target.
I'm going to pick that up, if I may, sorry. So I don't use the word threatening, and I don't use the word promising, but I think your point about signalling, particularly to financial analysts, is fair. I think on the transparency, which is really the point I wanted to pick up, I mean, Openreach did have an agreement with government. It does publish. I think what it publishes is really not very useful at all. And I think if you're open to it, we could have a proper conversation about that, because I know Ofcom recently talked to you about it, but actually what you now publish is actually even less useful than what you used to publish. So I think transparency would help. I think there's a conversation possibly to be had between Altnets and Openreach about that, because at the moment, I don't think what you publish helps get rational overbuild.
So Lindsey, do you want to respond to that in terms of what a regulator might do in terms of information, and where gets done and by how much? Or is that something that you essentially leave to the market?
Well, essentially, you know, we leave it to the market. As you say, the nature of competition is that people and individual companies decide where to go. What we do keep an eye out for is, and consider complaints, is what can be described as predatory overbuild by Openreach. So if there is an allegation that, if you like, Openreach weren't intending to go somewhere and then chose to do so at the last minute because of the presence of a competitor, we would certainly have a look at that. We haven't found that to be the case so far, and we obviously do have a lot of information from Openreach about what their plans are. We do know, of course, as well, that fibre plans do have to change a bit as you go along, because you can get somewhere and find it's not quite what you expected. So we certainly keep an eye on that as part of our sort of overall monitoring of the way that competition is playing out in the market. But of course, we'd be happy to take part in, you know, discussions about further transparency.
So yes, we've got a few more questions. Excellent.
Marcin Zieliński from Poland, from Polish Regulatory Office. I have the question mostly to Oliver, because what you were talking about, it was about the investments in Britain, which is the home market, I believe. But in the other market, where the competition is also fierce, is there any sort of KPIs, is any sort of strategy which will let your investment firm invest more or maybe quit because the market in UK becomes more attractive as the home market?
UK isn't actually our home market. It's where I'm It's my home market, but it's where I live. But Macquarie is an Australian headquartered firm, and I actually cover our business globally, but particularly in Europe. So in my bit of Macquarie Group, Macquarie Asset Management has an investment in Poland, actually, Ilia. We as a group have invested in Denmark, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, and the UK and Spain, so that does give us quite a useful perspective, actually, because I think what you realise in particular about Europe is every market is very, very different, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all proposition. I mean, I picking up on some of the earlier comments, I think the French, I think in hindsight, if we could have done something like the French model is better. I mean, I just think, I think the problem, it's had more fibre, cheaper, lower cost of capital, it's a better model. I think where we were in the late teens, it was sort of too late for us to go down that route. I think that was the challenge with the franchise model. It was a bit too late. It's the old adage that I wouldn't start from here, and the problem was we were in the wrong place to start there. I think it's wrong to say that. Wrong to say that our model is better, because I don't think it is. I think it was, but I think it is what we have, and we've got to sort of make the most of it. I wouldn't have to say emulate the Australian model. I would. It doesn't really work very well. won't go into why, but it costs a lot of money and is very unpopular. But so I think, but there are, you do need to look to take some lessons. So Spain, we were in Spain in 2019, and it was a tough place for infrastructure investors because there was lots of competition, lots of infrastructure competition. Where we have network, we're a wholesaler, might be one of 4, but it's very cheap to build because the ducts, Telefónica's ducts are new, but they're regulated really well and really early. So the regulation for accessing the ducts and for accessing data centers, Telefónica data centers, is really well understood. It's a mature wholesale market. Everyone wholesales from each other and knows how to wholesale from each other. And Telefónica is willing to wholesale. I mean, I do make that point again. Having your incumbent willing to wholesale of other providers really helps a market in competition. It really helps.
So I think we're nearly at the end. There's a gentleman down here who hasn't had an opportunity to ask a question. Can we just let this gentleman?
Thank you. Hello, Guy Miller from MS3 Networks. Yesterday I watched a keynote with Robert Viola from the European Commission say that they're going to take the lead now in promoting fibre to the citizens of Europe. Is it time that the UK government or the UK regulator started to promote fibre themselves and start to promote that maybe there is choice for residents?
I think.
Shall I have a
1
minute on that and then others come in? I mean, I think, honestly, I'm not sure as the regulator we'd do a great job of selling fibre. I think, the right set of initiatives for us to embark on are ones that we've been talking about switching, about fibre terminology to try and remove barriers to fibre take-up and make it easier. But I do very much agree with comments from the panel about what we should be selling fibre on, which is less on speed and more about use cases, which I think means something to people, and in particular on reliability.
I'm going to take the panellists' prerogative and ask the last question before we go, and then thank the panellists. So we've seen the Gigabit Infrastructure Act being talked about in the EU. One of the things about that act, it's about trying to reduce planning regulations, not just in, externally, but also in MDUs, like Catherine described, and also access to roofs for things like small cells. Is there an argument for something like that in the UK? Do you think that we should have that? Do we already have it?
Well, we did recently have an act that went through Parliament, a government act. So government put forward legislation to remove a lot of barriers, in particular to try and tackle some of the problems with wayleaves, and that passed through Parliament, and we're just seeing that happen now. Parliament actually rejected the MDU proposal that Catherine's put forward because it felt that, first of all, it was pretty intrusive on private rights, and Parliament was trying to sort of balance the two, and also because it would have given it would have disrupted the level playing field between Altlets and Openreach. But I mean, there's a new piece of legislation. It affects urban and rural areas, and I think there's a job for industry now to make what Parliament has given us work more effectively.
Fantastic. So we're now between the delegates and their lunch. I would just like to take an opportunity to thank our panellists. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, so thank you very much indeed.